The purpose of this presentation is to talk about the process of facilitating online discussion. I will try to gauge this conversation to where it is applicable at most levels of education where online courses and online discussion can be used, from elementary school all the way through graduate school to corporate training and so forth. Most of the literature in this area deals with higher education, but the principles are the same for using online discussion, whether it's middle school or whether it's graduate school. So all that I say is applicable. It just might have to be tailored some. Of course, while I'm going to try to keep this discussion focused on pedagogy and the facilitation of discussion, there is overlap with the design of an online course. You can only facilitate a discussion to the strength to which that discussion was designed. So by necessity, some of my comments might get more into design than into teaching. Let's start with a quote from the literature. Check out this quote. Dialogical process. There must be dialogue. A good online course has to be about more than delivery. There must be a back and forth among students, between the students and professor, etc. And I argue that, as seemingly does Petraglia, that an online course cannot be a good example of an online course unless there is a dialogical process going on here. Another quote. I think there's a lot of meat in this quote here. The facilitator, the formal authority in the classroom, has to provide gentle guidance and a loosely constructed framework. So the facilitation of online discussion has to be such that it's not dogmatic, not mechanical, but that it gives students freedom. It liberates them to explore the course material without restriction. Let's take a little closer look at this framework. Students, the learners, must be at the center of an online course. So all of the facilitation of that online course has to keep students at the center. Of course, students are not in this alone. I mean, the online course or the online experience should be designed such that all of these four things are supporting students and informing their work. Well, where does that leave the formal authority in the classroom then? Where is he or she in this process? The formal authority is facilitating from the periphery. So what I'm trying to do here is give you a framework for facilitation. a conceptual way of thinking about how we facilitate the online classroom, facilitate online discussion in particular. So what have we learned here? We've learned that there must be the need within an online class for learners to be at the center of activity, for there to be dialogue as a meaningful part of the learning process, and that there must be facilitation and guidance by the formal authority in the classroom. I sometimes see examples of online courses where the students just kind of answer questions based on a reading, for instance, in a discussion board, and that's the end of it. There is only the interaction of the learner to the content, and that's a start. But I argue, as does the literature, that if the formal authority is not facilitating and guiding the classroom process, then you cannot have a good example of an online course. Is this helping you understand, I would hope, the importance of good facilitation of an online classroom? These three criteria are non-negotiable in a strong example of an online course. Why? Because facilitation should touch the learner's mind. That is the whole point here. Wow, this is a paradigm shift for some of you. For those of you who have been taught that education, whether online or traditional, is about what the expert knows, what the expert can hand down, when actually we know from literature about teaching and learning in general, much less online discussion facilitation, that's not the point at all. It's not about what the expert knows about content. It is about the expert, the formal authority's ability to facilitate. Okay, finally, I'm to something practical. How? How does the good teacher, trainer, professor, the formal authority do this? Facilitate toward this framework that I have given you. In the rest of this slideshow, I am going to try to be very practical. There are things you need to understand about my practical guidance, however. First of all, it's suggestive, it's illustrative, not denotative. Take the ideas here and make them your own. Obviously, the practical guidance I'm giving you would look very different depending on whether you are teaching graduate students, corporate trainees, or middle school students. Obviously, it might differ depending on the content. The use of this within a math class will likely be very different than the use of this in a history class. And finally, by necessity, a lot of the practical guidance I'm going to give you is generic. You cannot be mechanical about it. There must be a fluidity. It is called discussion, after all. So there must be a back and forth, a give and take, a reaction to discussion. My framework suggests that the formal authority in online classrooms can facilitate discussion using three different assumed roles of engagement. And that's the point. The formal authority in the classroom must be engaged in the learning process. Those three roles are the role of teacher, counselor, and critic. In the name of full disclosure, I have stolen these three from my little nerdy world of marching band and dance teams and winter guard and so forth. Within the judging of these performing arts events, judges are trained to shape their commentary as the commentary of a teacher, a counselor, and a critic. And my training in that area transfers nicely to the online classroom. Now, these three, while I'm talking about these three in the area of facilitating online discussion, they actually can work quite well in providing feedback on most assignments within an online classroom. And obviously, there is some overlap among the three. But as I facilitate online discussion, I ask myself, what does this student or what do these students need right now? A teacher, a counselor, or a critic? Let's take a look at each of these three. First, in terms of a teacher, how do we facilitate with that framework in mind? I think one thing, we have to point students back to the fidelity of the assignment guidelines for the online discussion. From a teacher perspective, I sometimes will facilitate by starting a phrase simply with, hey, would it be useful to go back and read the assignment guidelines for what I'm looking for in online discussion? For instance, the assignment guidelines note that you should go beyond just summarizing what your classmates have said and get into reacting to what your classmates have said. Yet, I'm not sure I'm seeing reaction here. Now, what I've done in that comment that I just offered is I have pointed students back to the guidelines of the assignment. It's a perfectly appropriate way to facilitate. I think the role of the teacher in facilitating is to establish a safe place in terms of tone, and I think teachers can model this through their own informality and emojis. Informality, a word about that. It is discussion. It is not a place for formal essays. They are called discussion boards, not formal essay boards. And I think a sense of informality in discussion is appropriate. And I think teachers can facilitate by being a bit informal themselves as a way of establishing tone. If you are a student of mine in a class and are watching this video as a formal class assignment, then I likely have provided you with some links to information about netiquette and even emojis that you can take a look at, and even some guidelines on establishing a safe place in online discussion. In the role of a teacher, when I'm facilitating, I use that handout and think about that handout. Also, from the role of a teacher, as opposed to a counselor or critic, I think it's important to sometimes post prompts or questions to guide the discussion before the discussion starts. Help frame the scope of the discussion. Sometimes that's purely selfish on my part. If I ask, for instance, my high school music appreciation students to listen to a piece of music, I sometimes will post a question about what really interested me in that music. And I will say, look, among other things, I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about the composer's use of electronics in this piece. Did it work? Did it not work? Was it idiomatically appropriate? Was it distracting? So what I'm doing is I'm proactive. I mean, purely selfishly, I'm getting them to focus on things that interested me because I think I have a lot to learn from my high school students. But more in the role of a teacher, I am facilitating the discussion proactively by helping to limit the range of things we are going to discuss. To continue with my example, in a 7-minute piece of music, there's a lot to discuss there. And if I make it purely a free-for-all, just comment on whatever you want to comment on, the discussion might be so splintered that it doesn't gain any momentum. So teachers can facilitate by limiting. Also, in the role of a teacher, it is perfectly appropriate for the teacher to identify and correct content-based misunderstandings. Here is an example that I've made a bit more generic of content that I actually used in one of my classes last semester. This was a reply that I offered to a student, a graduate student, within online discussion. And sometimes it's even more obvious that students do not understand content. Now, when you are identifying and correcting the learner's content-based misunderstandings, do specifically identify what needs correcting, but do not correct it for them. Simply point them to the right place where they can correct the information. So far, we've looked at the role of a facilitator as teacher. Have you gained some strategies from this that you can use in facilitating online discussion? Before you move forward in this presentation, consider pausing it and just trying to jot down some of the ideas you've gained about the role of the teacher in framing an online discussion. After you jot down a few notes, continue playing this video and we will look at counselor and critic. In terms of counselors, there are 3 roles of the counselor. To get in the counselor mode is to co-create understanding with our students, to work in side-by-side collaboration with them, to model process. How can one proceed through time in iterative problem solving, in dealing with the types of cyclical and iterative activities that you've asked students to work on in the discussion boards or to discuss in the discussion boards. Again, to digress into design for a minute, a good online course must use a problem-solving approach. And I use the term problem-solving here. Possibly a better term would be to talk about engaging students in authenticity, in real world, authentic types of activities that students are dealing with in the discussion boards as the basis of discussion. And I think we can model process for students to help facilitate discussion. And finally, model thinking for students. Okay, let's get practical. How? How can a facilitator of online discussion carry out these roles of the counselor? Sometimes I think we have to counsel our students on the side through private messages, through emails, and particularly reticent students need counseling that sometimes might go something like this. So to try to bring individuals more fully into the discussion. And I think when we counsel in this way, we can help students see the potential ways that they can engage themselves, the ways they can help move the discussion forward and continue the conversation. Do not take sides or suggest superiority in perspectives when you are side coaching or side counseling individuals. I think another way we can counsel is to help the class as a whole within online discussion to understand, to encourage them to synthesize ideas within a discussion. You know, how does what Bobby said in this thread connect or not connect to what Jamal said in this conversation? We can encourage the synthesis of ideas as a counselor to facilitate discussion, to help the learners understand that all knowledge is integrated. My teenage daughter regularly makes fun of me because one of my mantras is everything connects to everything else. And I think there is value in facilitating an online discussion to helping our learners get that. Finding ways in the discussion board, not just to individual students, but in the board to everyone, of constantly counseling them toward back toward, but how does it connect? What are we building here? What are the larger integrated structures that make this thread of discussion not just discrete information, but something bigger? I think as a counselor, and again, this may not be appropriate in all settings with all, for instance, corporate training, but in most education, we want our students to be analyzing things critically and thinking critically. In facilitating online discussion as a counselor, we can emphasize the need for critical analysis and critical thought. Now, one way we can do that is to model and uncover our own critical analysis. This notion of uncovering our own critical analysis is very important. I sometimes will offer commentaries at the end of my own contributions to discussion. I will say things like these. It's not just that as a counselor facilitating online discussion, it's not just that we model thinking for them. We have to uncover that we are modeling for our students or our learners in a corporate training setting. I think also what we have to do here is point out opportunities for critical thinking to get them engaged. So it's beyond modeling. We have to facilitate toward bringing them beyond non-critical acceptance of ideas in a discussion. This is an actual quote from me from a discussion board from last semester. So can we constantly remind our learners as a counselor, as we try to counsel them within discussions, we've got to get beyond just statements of facts here. We've got to get into critical analysis and critical thought. Another approach to counseling, facilitating online discussion through the role of a counselor, is asking what I call beautiful questions. Those open-ended and probing questions that get learners thinking. If you are watching this video as a student in one of my courses, then I likely have provided you with more information on beautiful questions or probing questions. If you are not a student in my course, I strongly recommend that you Google the phrase, "a pocket guide to probing questions." That guide has been very useful to me in helping me format questions that I want to ask my students as I counsel them within the framework of facilitating online discussion, and often in broader assignments too. Let me just give you a few examples of question stems that have been helpful to me in facilitating online discussion as I reply to individuals or to groups of individuals who have contributed to a thread of discussion. Oh, I love the what if question. So much power in the what if toward counseling students, toward critical analysis, critical thinking, toward getting beyond what they would do without the formal authority facilitating. As a facilitator, I also have found great power in this last question. What are your own blind spots related to this topic? Sometimes I will suggest, as I've read this thread, it has occurred to me that some of you do have some blind spots in thinking about this topic. What might those blind spots be? This idea of moving the learners in an age-appropriate way, in a developmentally appropriate way, toward thinking about themselves as learners. I want to say a little bit more about that. I sometimes will use replies in discussion boards to individuals within the context of online discussion that goes something like this. getting them not just looking at content, but looking at their approach to their own work. By the way, I sometimes will ask the exact opposite question. In fact, I've had students point out to me that they will say to me, you know, Dave, last week in one of my posts, you asked me, what if I had forced myself to write a shorter summary and be more selective with details so that I could get on with the business of reacting within my discussion board post? But then this week, Dave, you asked me what would have happened if I had forced myself to write a slightly more detailed summary. Would I have gotten more out of it? So the point is, I'm not trying to move students toward a right answer to say that a shorter summary is better or a longer summary is better, or you commented on 2 things that your classmates said that you were replying to. What if you had commented on 3? I'm not suggesting that 3 is better than 2. I am suggesting that I want them, that a good counselor in facilitating online discussion gets the learner thinking about his or her own approach to that discussion. Before we move forward here, we have just spent time talking about the role of the counselor as a role of facilitating online discussion. Do you remember any of the practical strategies that we discussed? Before moving forward to look at the role of a critic, consider pausing this video and jotting down some of what you've learned about the role of the counselor. Once you've done so, you can continue this video to learn about the role of the critic. The role of the critic. I think the main thing we need to consider, when we hear the word critic, we think of criticize. I suggest that in facilitating online discussion, in the role of a critic, we want to reward achievement and the positive effectiveness of students' replies, not just criticize their replies. The critic is a far more expansive role than simply criticizing. It's the proverbial feedback sandwich, right? Say something positive about what the learners have done in a thread. One thing I really like about what you've done in this thread is that you've done a nice job of. Then get at something negative. But I feel like you have missed an opportunity to. Or you did not cover the reading thoroughly enough because you have left out the topic of. Then something positive again. It's a bit trite. The feedback sandwich is it best? Some research suggests it is not best. What some research suggests is we should start with the positive, then get on with the business of the negative, and end with that. However we do it, we must reward achievement, not just be punitive. Use the language of the criteria for evaluating the online discussion. Now, this does get into design a little bit, but hopefully, if you are expecting online discussion from your students, then you have given them clear criteria for the types of replies you're looking for, how you want them to reply, and an approach to replying. And that criteria is important. So in facilitating online discussion, we can only facilitate as a critic to the same power that the design of the online discussion, the stated criteria, has. In facilitating, I urge you to limit commentary about mechanical correctness. You know, the criteria asks for at least 3 paragraphs of 4 sentences each, of grammar, spelling. I mean, if this were a design presentation, I would talk about that most of these should not even be criteria. It is discussion, not formal essay. And we certainly wouldn't correct a student's grammar during class discussion at any level, from elementary school on up, I would hope. So is the discussion board even the appropriate place to deal with grammar, spelling? And length has nothing to do with substance. So to the extent that these are criteria, as you facilitate, I say limit the commentary about trivial mechanics and dichotomies of the discussion. Instead, maximize commentary about the criteria that deal with the qualities of good discussion. So there absolutely is overlap here with design. And I think as we are serving as a critic, as we are facilitating with our critic's hat on, we want to focus on the quality of the discussion over dichotomies of correctness. And I think that's true at all levels, even when engaging elementary school students online. I would like to say a little bit more about this notion of commenting with reference to qualitative criteria. Qualitative language is different. What if some of the criteria is that you want the students engaged in critical thinking, creative thinking, analytical thinking? How do you comment on that? What is the language of commenting on that? My department at Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, the Department of Educational Leadership, has developed a handout called The Indicators of Critical Thinking. And it is simply a sheet of guidance for how do you know if your students are thinking critically. So in online discussions, and if you are observing this slideshow as a formal student of mine in a course, I likely have shared this handout with you, the indicators of critical thinking. If, however, you are not, feel free to contact me. I will put my email address up at the end of this slideshow and ask me for the handout on the indicators of critical thinking. When I am facilitating online discussion, I have those indicators hanging on a little cork board next to my desk. And I use those indicators to help me serve as a critic as I comment on online discussion. So you do need to have a diverse vocabulary that is age appropriate, that you can shape your commentary around as a critic. But do not get stuck on some of those words more than others. Try to draw your students into thinking expansively about the qualities of their online discussion, not in a limited way about online discussion. The role of a critic. I think we also want our reactions to what's going on in discussion boards to venture beyond stated criteria and to be authentic. Certainly, we can comment from an intellectual perspective. But how about from an aesthetic perspective? One way I use this aesthetic perspective is if someone within an online discussion has a particularly interesting turn of a phrase, or they've articulated something in a unique way. I, in my replies within the online discussion as a critic, will reward the student. I like the way Cynthia expressed this idea of, and then give her turn of phrase. And then as a critic, I will analyze that. What this connotes to me is. So you are helping students understand the aesthetic dimensions of a discussion as you're facilitating that discussion. Authentically reacting as a critic, even emotionally. I was bothered by, I found joy in, I was annoyed with. I think that type of vulnerability as you're facilitating an online discussion, when used well, can be powerful. Once again, in the name of disclosure, I have stolen these from the world of theater. In the world of theater, I've heard multiple, and cinema, by the way, I have heard multiple script writers, directors, producers talk about the intellectual, the aesthetic, and the emotional dimensions of dialogue, of a scene, of interaction among people or within events. And I find that as a critic, thinking about these three can be useful as I facilitate online discussion. I resent talking about grades, and I will tell you that in my own college courses, online courses, I no longer assign a grade, A, B, C, D, F, or a percentage. It was an 88.52713. Because now you get the question of, well, what do I have to do to make it an 89? So I think even when we get into summary judgment, might we be better focusing on qualities rather than trying to quantify? But to the extent that you can't buy that, to the extent that part of facilitation is a summary judgment, go back to the criteria. When I am making summary judgments about student participation in online discussion, I will print out the criteria. I will have that criteria next to me as I comment. Now, those of you who are watching this as a student in my class, likely within this class, I model for you through some sort of rubric where I specify what is excellent contributions to online discussion, what are good contributions, fair contributions, unacceptable contributions. And within that rubric are the qualities, the criteria that I am expecting. As a facilitator, when I am offering summary judgments, Look, in this particular discussion board or this past week, I can only judge your contributions as fair. I then can facilitate that student's understanding. If in a private email, for instance, giving them a summary judgment of their work, I could facilitate that student's understanding of why I have offered the final judgment I have. Or within a thread of discussion, if I reply and say, look, I find this thread to be fair. My summary judgment of what the 5 of you have done in trying to explicate this topic is you did a fair job or a good job. I then can draw on the criteria to help them see the basis of my judgment. No snow jobs. And I find that many teachers in evaluating, particularly in K-12, but also in higher ed, they are too worried about being nice. Call it like you see it. Students do not benefit, whether corporate trainees, graduate students, undergrads, high school, middle school. Now, the calling it like you see it has to be offered in an age-appropriate way. My feedback to a class of middle school students online is not going to look like my summary judgments to a room of graduate students, an online room of graduate students. But call it like you see it. And to the extent that you have to have a grade, I think we have to put that grade in context. I love this quote from Speck. Now, again, this is higher ed literature, but I think we can substitute in here manager or trainer in a corporate setting, teacher in a K-12 setting, but subjective professional judgment of students' efforts. I think it's so important that we help our learners see that we are not, that this is not objectivity. I mean, think about the criteria. If you get beyond counting stuff, well, your post was 10 sentences long, therefore it's excellent. Well, what if those 10 sentences were completely irrelevant to the point of the discussion? You offered 3 paragraphs. You replied to 3 people. Well, none of that is substantive. And I think once we get into qualitative criteria, critical thinking, creative thinking, nuance, specificity, detail, relevance, we have to help students understand in our facilitation the subjective professional judgment of students' efforts. Before we move forward in this slideshow, we have just covered the role of the critic. You might consider pausing this slideshow and jotting down a few things that you've learned about the role of a critic. Once you've done so, you can then hit play to continue the last couple of slides of this slideshow. The references that I have used to construct this slideshow, I mean, first of all, I've been teaching online. I taught my first online course, completely online course, I think in 1994. So I have a lot of practical experience here. I also have used more formally some of these sources. One could argue that these sources are quite old, but I think in some ways that's the point. The principles of good teaching and good facilitation of discussion do not change simply because we are taking things into cyberspace, into the online classroom. We can use the principles of good teaching to facilitate an online discussion, just as we do a face-to-face discussion. And I think in thinking about these three roles of teacher, counselor, and critic, you now have to take the information that I've provided you with in this slideshow and apply it in ways that are authentic to you and ways that are appropriate given the development of your learners and your content. You have to get beyond a mechanical application and bring your own sense of authenticity and vulnerability to the role of being a teacher, counselor, and critic. I hope this presentation has been useful to you. If you are a student in one of my courses, then surely I've provided you with a discussion board where we can discuss this presentation. If you are not a student of mine, then I absolutely welcome hearing from you by email. I hope that this has been useful to you.